All right. Welcome, everybody, to the first of many or several tricky topics in climate and ag that is being hosted by the Oregon Community Food Systems Network's subgroup Climate Resilience and Stewardship, which is a group that is under the umbrella of the Farming for the Future Working Group, a group of farm service providers and allies who work on all sorts of different issues regarding the production system of our community food systems. And my name's Andrew. I am the coordinator for the working group and staff member at Oregon Community Food Systems Network. This subgroup is chaired by Megan Kemple, who's director at the Oregon Climate and Agricultural Network. And today we are going to be hearing from some great experts who are very kind to give us their time to educate us on climate or on ag, soil, carbon sequestration, and all the details that go into that to help us and all of y'all to be better informed and more confident as you work with farmers and the public in communicating this this important and relevant and on lots of people's minds topic in carbon soil sequestration. So a couple of updates just up at the top about Oregon Community Food Systems Network and our subgroup in the Farming for the Future Working Group. We're going to be doing several of these tricky topics in the future. We chose this topic that was prioritized by folks who came out to our convening in February, and the carbon sequestration questions and interests were prioritized as the most important. So we decided to go with that first. Second in line is water, and there's a couple others, so we'll be going into those in the future. Just one update, I've been sending emails out to the list regarding there's some funding that's being discussed in the legislature for disaster resilience grants through the drought relief package. That's been moved to the rules committee, and we are submitted testimony. There's funding that would go through Oregon Community Food Systems Network in that package, and right now we're in the kind of the budget wrangling of that process. So we'll keep you all informed as that moves forward. And then we're also one thing that's on my radar is we're going to be sharing a presentation to the full network on May 19th, and you'll get an update about that on Oregon land use law and farmland protection from experts in the network, Greg and Nellie McAdams. Greg at Thousand Friends of Oregon and Nellie at Oregon Ag Trust, giving folks some background on Oregon land use laws and farmland protection. And that's going to be to kind of help folks get informed about some of the legislation that's going through the legislature at this point that impacts Oregon land use laws. So with that all said, I want to introduce our presenters and make sure they have as much time as possible to share this tricky and dense topic. We've got Mike Badzmierowski. I actually haven't said your last name.
Badzmierowski.
Badzmierowski, who has a PhD from Virginia Tech Graduate School in crop and soil environmental sciences, and is the soil health specialist for Oregon Department of Agriculture. And we have Jennifer Moore, who has a PhD from Oregon State University in soil science and is a research soil scientist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service. And yeah, that's our introduction, and we're just going to hand it over to our experts. And at the end, they'll each have about 15 minutes, and then at the end, there'll be time for y'all to ask your burning questions and clarifications. So we'll just kind of take it from there. Thanks.
Another thing, Andrew, I think it might be helpful for Jen and Mike to know their audience a little bit.
Oh, that's great.
So I don't think with all of these this great attendance we have, we shouldn't probably take time to go around. But if people don't mind right now, putting their name and at least name and org in the chat, that will help Mike and Jen be able to scan and know their audience. Unfortunately, Mike, you won't have that before you launch in, but you can scan it as we get into questions and such. And Mike, if you want to go ahead. kick us off. That'd be great.
All right, thank you. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm the soil health specialist at ODA, and I know I've met several of you. And for those that I haven't, nice to meet you, and hopefully we'll interact more. So, does everyone see a full screen?
We're seeing your split screen. Seeing your presenter view.
That's on mine. So 1 second. Mike,
I think if you just go swap displays, you should do it.
There we go.
There you go.
All right.
Super.
So thank you, everyone. Anyways, so as I mentioned, I'm the soil health specialist, and I'm going to talk to you kind of giving the basics behind soil carbon sequestration and kind of all the definitions a little bit so we can kind of get introduced into the topic. I'll be giving a little bit of data, and then Jen will be hopefully following up with more local data. So the first thing that I always like to mention is that agriculture, the main point of it is to provide us with food and fiber, and that should always be kept in mind. So we want to maintain and increase productivity, but obviously we would like to do that as sustainably as possible. But one of the most important things that we can do to actually reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture is to intensify the current areas that we already have in production. So going into the background of soil organic matter, and I put in parentheses or a slash carbon, is that soil organic matter is the portion of soil that's composed of living and dead things in various decomposition stages. And so anything that's less than 2 millimeters of that is considered soil organic matter. And the reason that for the slash is that carbon is the main constituent in soil organic matter, but there is no just carbon floating around in the soil by itself. It's part of a matrix, and that matrix is soil organic matter. But in that matrix, it also contains like hydrogen, oxygen, and a lot of our essential nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. The majority of our soil organic matter is actually microbial in origin, and that's coming from either a lot of dead microbial fragments. And really what that means is that for organic matter to persist a long time in soils, we generally have undergoing of microbial degradation of organic matter, and then it gets recycled into other microbial degradation cycles. So how can soil organic matter and carbon persist for centuries? Well, the historical view was that we kind of had potentially what's called a humification process, where we kind of created stable compounds. But the emergent understanding over the last decade and a half to 2 decades is that there's really on this right side different pathways for carbon to get essentially away from the microbes before they break it down. So you could have physical disconnection where in pore space of soils, there's some microbes that can't access that organic matter to break it down. Or in the soil, there can be options where that with the different reactions in the soil, it can just adhere essentially to the soil particles. And then other pathways that we don't necessarily experience as much in Oregon is freezing of soils. So if in frozen soils, microbial activity is lower, therefore it can persist longer. So kind of in this new idea, we don't really have as much our previous understanding, we thought that organic matter, there was certain compounds that could resist microbial attack. And we've kind of shifted more towards this area of there's many different processes going on in the soil that can help to persist. But really, any of these things can still destabilize and still provide access to microbial degradation. So one of the things I like to think about is kind of how much carbon is in your soil. And essentially, it's driven by how much temperature, or the temperature and precipitation of your area, the geology, the soil texture, and the soil oxygen levels. And all of these kind of determine how much carbon can really be in your soil. So if we think about increased temperature and water, we can see an increase in soil carbon. If we have an increase in temperature but a decrease in water, we will most likely see a decrease in your soil carbon. One of the reasons I kind of mentioned that is just thinking about in Oregon, where mainly in the central to eastern parts of the state, and maybe even parts of the southern areas, with increasing temperatures but decreasing water supply, we could see a decrease of our soil carbon. In clay mineralogy, so this is kind of thinking about the geology and where, how the clay formed. Essentially, higher activity soils means that they can retain more nutrients and water, which can increase your soil carbon capacity. If we think about soil oxygen levels, if you think about a wetland, if you think about bogs, essentially what happens is you're decreasing oxygen, so you're reducing a lot of microbial activity. So that's why we kind of see a large soil carbon stocks in those areas. And then lastly is as we increase finer textured soils, so if you go from sand to silt to clay, those are our different soil fractions, particle sizes, we can see that there will be an increase in soil carbon capacity. So kind of all of these different factors can influence how much carbon will be naturally in your soil. And then kind of when we think about how can we manage this, we do have to think about the environmental constraints on how we can build soil organic matter. So the one or two things that we really need a lot of is water and nitrogen. Without water and nitrogen, it'll be really hard to build up our soil carbon stocks. So kind of thinking once again more, not necessarily as prevalent in the northwest corner of Oregon, but in drier parts of the state where we have a lot of irrigation going on, if we do start facing more and more water limitations, essentially the irrigation and the nitrogen that we've been applying to all of these farmlands, we could actually see reductions in our soil carbon stocks if we're not able to keep up that same supply of water and nitrogen to feed the microbial activity that increases plant productivity, all of these different elements that can increase our carbon into the soil. So we just really have to keep that in mind in the reality of different parts of the state on how we can build more soil organic matter and carbon into our soils. How much carbon can I expect to accumulate in my soil or your soil? So soils can only hold a certain amount of carbon, and that's influenced by soil texture, the mineralogy, and your current soil organic matter stock. So I know I kind of touched on this about 2 slides ago, but essentially, if we think about different pore spaces of sand and silt and clay, the different surface areas of these different particle sizes allow for different interactions with organic matter. So as we get into the smaller size fractions of soil, we can expect more activity for carbon to adhere to those soil surfaces. So essentially in areas that have more fine textured soils, we can expect there to be an increase in carbon. And I kind of touch on this here. It's called carbon saturation theory in this bottom left-hand corner. This was a recent analysis that came out where essentially we can accrue a lot of carbon in soils that have lost a lot of carbon or are not near their potential for how much carbon they can hold. And as I mentioned 2 bullets ago, is that's influenced by the mineralogy, the soil texture. So essentially, if in a lot of our agricultural soils, we lost a lot of our carbon due to tillage or different production activities, we can expect that if we're far away from the theoretical holding point of carbon of a given texture size and mineralogy, we can expect greater amounts of carbon to accrue. But as we go along the x-axis, so the bottom horizontal line, as we approach what the soil can hold for carbon, it can either not hold any more carbon, or you could actually even lose the carbon that's there. So it's just important to keep in mind that the best areas that we can find to increase soil carbon are those where the mineralogy and the soil texture allow for greater capacity to hold carbon. And then I always like to throw in this, that there is possibly a way to love your soil too much, whether it's from organic amendments or other options, but it is possible to have too much organic matter in your soil. So soil organic matter, as I was kind of mentioning at the end of the last slide, is that as we're approaching more the holding capacity of your soil, essentially your soil can't hold anymore. So it's just going to be utilized by microbes and break down into greenhouse gases. It can harm the plants itself. You can actually, if you exceed really high levels of organic matter, have reductions in your plant yields, and you can pollute water bodies. So I kind of like to make that known of just whether it's community gardens and other places that have access more to organic amendments, that it is possible to add too much. And then I just give this slide here if you want to look at some current understanding of the latest soil organic carbon research. This top article is actually a Popular Science article that is for the public to understand soil organic matter better. And I would really recommend reading it. And I give one slide on, so previously I was mentioning all about organic matter. There is a lot of also inorganic carbon in Oregon. So soil inorganic carbon is made up of calcium carbonate, which is essentially a calcium salt. And you can even think of, it's kind of like the antacids that you take. So soil organic carbon actually accounts for nearly 40% of soil carbon stocks worldwide. And it's been usually neglected because people have thought in the past that it is relatively stable. However, with the use of nitrogen fertilization, and there's more nitrogen in the atmosphere that gets put back into the soil through different biochemical processes, you can actually have a lot of losses of soil organic carbon stocks, which is usually in the form of carbon dioxide fluxes. So this is just important in Oregon. I like to bring that up. There's not a lot of research currently done on it, but there are some worldwide studies that do show kind of just with the acidification of our soils from nitrogen fertilization that we can lose some of our inorganic carbon stocks. And I like to point out that they are irreversible. It's a hard issue to bring up, that hopefully we get more research in this area, but that's all I'm going to talk about on inorganic carbon. So brief background on net carbon sequestration. We talk about a little bit on soil carbon sequestration. We talk about just carbon sequestration. It's really important that we use the word net in front of carbon sequestration if we're thinking about climate mitigation. So the net additional storage of carbon from atmospheric carbon dioxide after accounting for any greenhouse gas losses. So I made this little figure yesterday that hopefully kind of breaks it down a little bit more. So we can think of carbon as in the soil and plants as our bank. So we have a carbon bank, and just like the money in these carbon banks, we can easily lose that money from either fire or tillage. Our deposits, so the green arrows, are increasing our bank account. And when producers are implementing practices that increase soil carbon or biomass carbon, whether think about even orchards or vineyards in our cases where we have a lot of that perennial biomass, we're increasing our carbon stocks. Our withdrawals are what happens when gases are released into the atmosphere. So this is coming naturally from microbes breaking soil organic matter, which I have as black dots in the soil. So it can come from carbon dioxide naturally there, or we can think of tractor emissions from carbon dioxide. Cattle is a strong releaser of methane emissions, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas emission, or nitrogen fertilizers, where a lot, if they're not used efficiently, will break down into nitrous oxide emissions. So it's really thinking about all of these balances here. And so essentially, if you have more deposits, so increasing your carbon stocks in the soil or the biomass, than you do the withdrawals, then you have achieved net carbon sequestration. But you really need to account for the nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide emissions to determine whether or not you're net sequestering. Additionality and leakage. So additionality, these are going to be concepts you might hear more often as we think about carbon markets. Additionality refers to the increased carbon uptake or the reductions of non-carbon dioxide gases that are additional to what would have occurred in a baseline or counterfactual scenario. So essentially what that means is if people are already cover cropping across the Willamette Valley, it will not meet the standards of additionality if that one farmer who's not doing cover crops decides to take that up. Leakage refers to ensuring that a practice does increase emissions outside the practice boundaries. This is especially prevalent for practices that reduce yields. And this is a really important concept to understand, that it's very difficult to determine if certain agricultural practices are a net carbon sequestration practice, because if essentially we're implementing practices and we just have to dig up places somewhere else in the world to meet the yield gaps, you would have to do a lot more accounting to understand of whether or not the practice is a net carbon sequestration practice. So this report came out in 2022, which asked carbon scientists to kind of think about what approaches in agriculture could lead to long-term soil carbon storage. So the figure on the top right is showing that the most consensus was conversion to perennial crops. And I would like to think that it really needs to think about more about conversion to perennial food crops, because if we're converting a food crop area to a non-food crop, that could potentially just lead to a lot of leakage. Conversion to no-till and cover cropping did not see as much love, but there were some people that did put as all the above as the strongest approach. Riparian restoration beyond edge of field was another one that someone voted for. So really it's thinking about what can keep constant biomass and constant processes that put carbon into the soil. Participants from this survey really emphasized that you need to track all greenhouse gas emissions associated with cropland management, and that if we only focus on soil carbon, it could fail to quantify the climate effects from cropland management. And then experts also reinforce the rate that it's really nuanced in the sense that different geographies and different practices in different areas of the country, it'll be really hard to say where certain practices are going to work better than others. And then the bottom right figure is just showing that there's a lot of sentiment among different carbon scientists on whether or not we should be using carbon as our goal for management in agricultural soils. So some view it that we should definitely be thinking about it as a climate mitigation strategy. And then there's others that say we really absolutely shouldn't be thinking about that when it comes to agricultural management and soil carbon sequestration. I know Jen and I really agree on this topic, but nitrogen has to be talked about. I know we're kind of on a carbon panel, but nitrogen is a major limiting nutrient. As I mentioned earlier, we need soil to build soil carbon. We need nitrogen fertilizer. And essentially without that nitrogen fertilizer, we wouldn't see the enormous yield gains that we've had over the last 50 decades or so. And really the most important way to reduce our nitrous oxide emissions is to improve the nitrogen use efficiency. And really that nitrogen use efficiency is just making sure that we're using it at the right source, the right rate, and the right time, and the right place. So those are the 4 R's that you'll see sometimes from NRCS promote. And then I just have 2 quick slides left, and then I'll let Jen take it away. So this meta-analysis that looked at cover crops' effects on soil health and productivity, they looked at how comparing a cover crop to no cover crop affected soil carbon, and then it also included different greenhouse gas emissions. They didn't do a full accounting, so we don't really know what practices, if they were net carbon sequestration or not, but cover crops do increase soil organic carbon, but they also increase carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions. I will note that there are significantly less studies that focused on greenhouse gas emissions compared to there's nearly 1,200 studies. So that's what this first number means is the number of studies. So there was about 1,200 studies in soil organic carbon versus 43, 25, and 30 studies for those greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really important that we get more data on that. No-till and soil carbon. Kai et al. From last year found that no-till increased the surface significantly, but decreased stocks at lower depths. And because of that, it led to a decrease in stocks as a whole in the entire profile for 14 years, essentially, is what their analysis showed, and that after 14 years, we can make up that gap in no-till. But there will be a significant debt for potentially up to more than a decade. And my last slide is just showing, now if we think about greenhouse gas emissions, a 2018 review looked at carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions, and they did see a lower carbon dioxide and methane comparing no-till to conventional till, but there was a significant increase in nitrous oxide emissions. They didn't do a full accounting to say whether or not it was net carbon sequestration, but it's just showing that it's a difficult topic that we still need more data on. And with that, I'll kick that over to Jen.
Great. Megan, would you like me to just go into it, or did you want to pause at all?
Just thank Mike. Thank you so much, Mike, for that presentation, and ready for you to launch in, Jen.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's a complex topic to cover. I thought that was really a great intro. Let's see if I can get my, got 3 screens here. Did I click the right one?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And hold on. Okay, great. And you see this little laser pointer? Shindig?
Yes.
Okay. I also can't see anybody anymore, but I guess that's okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. Again, I'm Jen Moore. I'm a research soil scientist with the Forage, Seed, and Cereal Research Unit here in Corvallis, Oregon, at the USDA ARS facility. And again, we're here today to talk about the potential of Oregon croplands to sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a couple of slides just to reemphasize what Mike has already done a great job of setting the stage for us. I also like to highlight how important soils are in helping to potentially mitigate climate change. And that's really because soils store such huge amounts of carbon. In fact, globally, soils store about 4 times the amount of carbon than that stored in the vegetation on land. And because they store so much, how we manage them can have a big impact, like Mike has already discussed. So first and foremost, we have to protect what we have and avoid further losses due to subsequent land conversions or intensive practices that deplete those resources. And secondly, whereas most ag soils are not at their saturation capacity, although some may be, there is a pretty big potential to allow them to store more carbon. And that's often talked about in these practices, sometimes referred to as regen ag, soil health, or conservation management. The harder question that Mike set us up for is like how quickly is dependent on a whole bunch of complex interactions of the management shift with soil type, depth, topography, climate change pressures, and as well as socioeconomic hurdles. The good news is that a lot of the technologies needed to achieve these improvements are available, and they are relatively cost effective. And many of the farmers across the US and here in the Valley have implemented conservation practices for years and years. And we can still do more by building from their successes. So again, protect what we have and rebuild where we can. And it was cool to see Mike talking about carbon as a soil, as a carbon bank. I like to do the same thing. So, he already kind of covered this, so I won't go into it. But overall, the goal is to choose practices where additions and protection are greater than removal and losses, while recognizing that carbon must flow. We can't just lock it all away. Similar to our bank accounts, if we put all of our money into savings, we'd pretty much not be very successful humans, because we wouldn't have any finances and resources to support ourselves. So similarly, carbon must flow through the soil to help support the system. And again, it's beyond this talk to, go beyond carbon. But as Mike alluded to, also increasing soil carbon is only one benefit of increasing soil organic matter. Increasing that organic matter improves water storage, availability, drainage, filtration. It builds stable aggregates that helps resist the erosive forces of water and wind. It increases that nutrient pool, all those essential elements that Mike talked about in the matrix of organic matter. And it increases biodiversity by supporting the vast numbers and types of soil microbes and other organisms that call soil their home. So carbon sequestration is just one of many benefits that I like to make sure that we don't forget about. But we are trying to focus today on carbon. And so I tried to look into the research and the literature as best we could. I have been in the soil health realm for decades, but I'm relatively new to our ARS unit here. I've been here about 2 years. And so we are working really hard. Actually, my team is out in the field collecting soil samples as we speak to help build a carbon inventory that we're trying to develop. But how much carbon do Willamette Valley croplands store? And how much carbon a soil stores is often called the soil carbon stock. They can be in different units. Here I'm showing them in tons of carbon per acre. Today, I like to frame how much carbon is stored in Willamette Valley cropland in relation to US averages. And so these data are from a variety of sources. This US crop average is from a large study from other scientists in the country, whereas the other data that I'll be sharing is on a more isolated number of fields. But I wanted to give real data from the Valley from work that has been conducted by scientists at ARS and at OSU. So these data are from my colleague, Kristen Tripp, and her collaborator, Amber Moore from OSU. These subsequent data are from Regina O'Kelly, who is a PhD student at OSU, and work done in collaboration with NRCS. So to get us started, the US, I like to start with the US average to give a reference point and to illustrate that the valley soils can store relatively large stocks of carbon. Again, protect what we have. On average, US cropland stores about 20 tons of carbon per acre in the top foot. And our perennial-based systems, such as that shown here with tall fescue as an example, stores about twice that amount on average, and they store relatively more carbon than annual row crops under no-till or conventional till practices. And then within annual row crops, this particular study, the survey done by Regina in collaboration with NRCS, showed that in the Valley, the no-till management, and this is on one particular soil, I think it's the Woodburn soil, stored more carbon, roughly 8 tons per acre more carbon than the fields under conventional tillage. And as Mike already alluded to, most of the samples are collected in the top foot. There's a lot of valid reasons why we focus on the top foot, but we know, and Mike did a great job expressing, that there's a lot more carbon if we look deeper. And sometimes when we look deeper, we might get a different interpretation. However, in this study, or in these studies that went down to about a meter, or it's about 39 inches, we still see a similar trend. We still see that tall fescue has about 20 tons per carbon, 20 tons of carbon per acre more than the US average. This bar is just the minimum and the maximum of that average, just to remind us that this is an average made up of a lot of different data points. But again, on average, the 22 fields that were surveyed in this study had about 20 tons of carbon per acre more than the US average, and they were still the highest compared to the other cropping systems in the valley that were evaluated. And in this particular case, it was encouraging to see that even at depth all the way down to 100 centimeters or 39 inches, the no-till row crop, the annual system, was still sequestering more carbon at about 5 tons per acre more than the conventional till. And then Regina also looked at hazelnut systems in the valley, and they were on par with the no-till system and still a little bit less than the perennial grass seed system.
Jen, this is Megan. Before you go on, just wanted to clarify, I think you mentioned it, but just wanted to make sure everyone caught it, that it's correct, that the tall fescue is a perennial system, and then the no-till and conventional are annual crops.
Yes, thank you for that. Yep, perennial, annual row crops, and then hazelnut, of course, is a perennial system as well. So in addition to the soil carbon, it's a little bit, I just want to focus on what's happening in the soil, but of course the hazelnut trees are also storing more carbon in the woody biomass. So that's another benefit. And Mike already talked about it, but carbon is just one piece of this very complex puzzle of carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emission reductions. And this is largely because of this intertwined relationship between the soil carbon cycle and the soil nitrogen cycle. And even when we can put more carbon into the soil and release and make fewer withdrawals or losses from the system, we still have to account for nitrous oxide. It's a really important greenhouse gas. It has a really strong global warming potential relative to carbon dioxide. And based on the EPA inventory that comes out every year, the majority of nitrous oxide released from soils is related to that nitrogen fertilization. So by reducing nitrogen inputs, we can reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Those are permanent also reductions that are less dynamic than something as in flux as carbon. But as Mike already talked about, we have to do it while maintaining productivity and not have a negative impact on crop yields. If we lose our crop yields, we're losing the amount of carbon that can go into the soil. And so that might have a negative impact overall on the system. So all of that is to say, we have to include the impact of management on both carbon and nitrous oxide emissions. In general, there's, Mike mentioned, from a soil perspective, methane tends to not be too much of an issue, except in rice production systems. The majority of temperate soils tend to be actually a uptake of carbon, or sorry, of methane. But there certainly are exceptions, and there's really limited data on methane. I look forward to studying that in the coming years as we just got a system to be able to measure that. So I'm just focusing today on carbon and nitrogen. And then the other tricky part is that soil carbon, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide, they all have very different concentrations. We talk about them in different units, and carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide differ in their global warming potential. So we have to figure out a way to get them all on an equal playing ground. What scientists do is to be able to compare them equally, we basically convert the nitrous oxide relative to the global warming potential of carbon dioxide, and we just call that carbon dioxide equivalence. And there's lots of ways to express that, but one of the common units are in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. And that is important because I wanted to share with you the next slide to try to estimate what is the net, in this case, emission reduction potential. So that's soil carbon sequestration, the inputs and exports of carbon dioxide from the system, and the release of that other big important greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide. And what is that reduction potential from the adoption of cover cropping in Benton County? So whenever possible, like the data I just shared, we of course prefer real data collected from the field, but that is not practical nor feasible to do on every farm in every county across the country, in the state, let alone across the country. So therefore, we often defer to models to predict what might happen. And so answering this question, we can look to a tool called Comet Planner. And unfortunately, just bear with me here, the answer is that it depends. Even with cover cropping, it is a very complex system, and there's different scenarios and different factors that we have to take into consideration. And this is really going to, I think, drive home the point of why it's so important to not only look at carbon stocks and uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also the release of nitrous oxide. So these are just 4 different scenarios that this tool allows people to play around with. It depends on whether you're adding a legume or non-legume cover crop. It depends whether you're adding that on irrigated or non-irrigated cropland. And then it also depends on what happens to your nitrogen fertility program after adding those. So there are 4 different scenarios here. If we only looked at the impact on carbon sequestration and the reduction of carbon dioxide from this overall system, the blue numbers indicate that in tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre per year, blue is good. It's a net gain of carbon. But that doesn't include the nitrous oxide. These values are all negative and they're all red. And so these numbers indicate either a carbon loss and or a greenhouse gas increase from the adoption of converting cropland that did not have cover crop to one with cover crop. So these all have a negative impact on how much was sequestered in the soil, such that 2 of the scenarios result in an increase in net benefit to reduction of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre per year. One of the scenarios actually releases more greenhouse gases from the system, and one has neither a net gain or a net benefit. And so this is cover cropping. These are the modeled estimates from the region. They need to be calibrated. We are working with the developers of the descent model from which it's built on to improve these estimates. But cover cropping in the valley may not be the best practice for sequestering carbon. There's a lot of other reasons to do it, but maybe not for carbon mitigation potential. But as Mike alluded to, converting some of that land or at least including perennial crops in the rotation may have a better and bigger impact. And with the models, as best as the experts in the field are working on currently, converting intensive till to no-till. This is modeled to the top foot, so it doesn't account for all of the depths, but that's what they have to work with at the moment. These 2 practices both result in a positive impact. Now, the Comet Planner is just literally for planning. It's a broad average, but sort of back of the envelope calculation, if you will. Other tools, such as something called Comet Planner, provides better site-specific conditions to acquire more detailed assessments. And so I encourage you to look at that if that's of interest to you. And just to recognize that there are lots of different pathways, there's lots of different practices. There is no one size fits all. The different system and the resources available to the farmer have to kind of drive what we try to promote over the region. And these are some of the research that is in progress with my team and others here at the USDA ARS, looking at all these different practices, focusing primarily in the grass and forage crop seed systems, but also working in hops and looking at adding amendments, biochar, and basalt dust, and ultimately, we will be developing the Willamette Valley Soil Carbon Inventory and Decision Support Tool to help guide our research and also to aid in future decisions to support farmers across the state. So some key takeaways is that soil management does play an important role. It is complex, and it depends on a lot of different factors, how much one practice can support carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gases versus another. In general, a lot of our farmers are doing a really good job. We have a lot of perennial systems here in the valley. The grass seed industry has a lot, the specialty crops have a lot. And we also have a lot of good soil health management in our relatively high fertile soils here. So again, can't emphasize the need to protect what we have, but we can do better. We can improve the situation. And there are numerous projects going on to help us get us there. And then ending again on, please don't forget that if in the case of cover cropping, it might not be the best practice for sequestering carbon and reducing greenhouse gases in Benton County, for example, but it has all these other wonderful benefits that should not be neglected. And with that, I thank everybody for their attention. Here's my email and my cell phone. If I don't answer your questions as we proceed, please feel free to reach out to me later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. That was really great and really complimentary.
Yeah, thanks for
really helpful to have the science and then to have Jen go more into what's happening in Oregon.
Okay, so folks, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll use that as a stack. We've got about 12 minutes. So I see Nicole, you have a question.
Yes, thank you both so much. I just learned a lot from that. I've been scratching my head over some of these very things. I work with a lot of conventional growers, large commodity growers, and a lot of the programs we see for soil health, like incentives don't really apply. And a lot of them are saying, well, why can't you reward us or pay us for what we're already doing? And we don't have a program to do that, to just pay people for growing grass seed. So I'm open to suggestions for how to incentivize other things, and I'm searching for those. One question specifically, I've been hearing and learning more about this nitrogen loss, and that we focus a lot on carbon, and learning more about the importance of leaching and volatilization of nitrogen. I'm wondering what you think of some of these products that are out there, additives to help stabilize nitrogen in fertilizers.
I'll take a stab at it, and then Mike, if you have something to add. The short answer is I don't really know. We don't actually work with a lot of additives and products, but we Kristen Tripp is a research soil scientist here who has really done some really great pioneering work on biochar. They developed a great biochar atlas, and biochar is one of the products that has been proposed as a way to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, because it tends to help bind up the nitrogen and keep it out of play. It's kind of a new research topic, and it's one thing that we aim to look at in the next 5 years, that add amendments in one of the last slides I had will be adding biochar and tracking nitrous oxide emissions from those applications. So hope to have more information for you soon, but that's all I can offer right now. Thank you. Mike?
Nicole, I'm assuming you're talking about like nitrification inhibitors, stuff like that, or?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of there's a specific product that some of there's, gosh, it's some kind of polymer, I believe, that is added to like directly to the sprayer with the fertilizer, and the idea being that it would reduce volatilization essentially.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, that's definitely seen as one of the best pathways to hopefully improve, or a pathway to improve nitrogen efficiency. And I would say Jen works more in the grass seed world than I do, but my assumption is we could always update nitrogen recommendation levels and kind of trial that more to see, are we over applying nitrogen in these areas, which I wouldn't be surprised if we are. But I think that's a good way. Hopefully there'll be a lot of recognition there for getting funding for that as a potential pathway to reduce emissions.
Yeah, actually OSU, Amber Moore is a fertility expert here. I know she does some work on that, and Nicole Anderson, Tom Chastain in the grass seed community has done a lot of those nitrogen efficiencies and reducing ammonia volatilization too, which we didn't talk about, and that kind of thing. So there are some research out there. You might look to the extension site at OSU to get more information.
Thanks, you guys.
Other questions?
I'll ditto what Jen said. Oh, Kaylin has one.
Hi, my name's Kaylin Barter, and I run the Oregon Water Policy Program for Wild Salmon Center, and learned so much. This is fascinating. I get a chance to work with farmers and ranchers across the state, and some of them are, I would say, evangelical about soil carbon sequestration. And others are skeptical, and it kind of spans the full spectrum. But I guess two things I wanted to ask about. First was I loved the mention about the co-benefits for soil erosion and ecosystem outcomes, and that led me to wonder: are you or is anyone here aware of whether there's funding that's coming through as a result of BIL or IRA or ARPA or all of the different alphabet soup that can help to address the question that Nicole had highlighted of like, what can we do to help people who are already doing, what they need to be doing, and others who haven't been able to do what they maybe we'd like to see them doing.
It seems like a lot of money is going towards things that are directly tied to new practices. I understand a lot, and it goes to that additionality problem. If people are already doing it, it's already there, and most of the time they're doing it because it helps their system. It's probably helping their profitability or increasing yields or things like that. There's a reason why they're already doing it. So yeah, I don't know how much hope there is on getting funding for that, but it seems like Megan might have a comment on that.
I do just want to make sure everyone's aware. Just want to mention the state policy that's in play right now. The Healthy Soils Bill does include grants for soil health practices, and really specifically lays out in the statute that the bill that the incentive should be available for continuing practices, continuing existing soil health practices, as well as new practices. And then there's also potential funding through Natural Climate Solutions Bill. And that bill does not specify, I don't think, either way at that level. It just doesn't get to that level of detail. But both of those are potential state funding opportunities.
And I'll just add in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, and maybe Jen can add where I miss, a lot of that funding is going into existing NRCS conservation programs. So, and Mike kind of touched on that it's paying for new practices. So again, an alphabet soup of EQIP and the Conservation Stewardship Program. The Conservation Stewardship Program is a nice one for people who are already doing practices and want to build out additional practices. It doesn't necessarily reward you for existing practices, but can build things out a little bit more. And so the state of Oregon is seeing a huge increase in those funding buckets. They're trying to come up with cooperative agreements to provide more funding to underserved farmers and do increased outreach to those farmers as well. So that's coming down. You know, the first deadlines were at the end of March and the beginning of April, and that funding is just going to increase over the next 3 years or so. And then finally, I think the other interesting piece to follow will be looking at supply chain demand. And as some of the larger buyers, whether you're talking about General Mills or you know, even some of the specialty stuff like Annie's or something like that, they're going to start having these requirements for growers to start doing certain practices so that they can say that they're cutting their greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of sticky stuff in there. And, you know, I've heard some producers talk about death by 1,000 checklists. And so if they have buyers that are asking them to do certain practices, it's just going to be more and more challenging. So it's going to be interesting as these evolve. And the final thing is the USDA Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program just is getting rolling, which is a huge investment in trying to sort of build markets and build verification standards and things like that. So a lot is going to be happening over the next 3 to 5 years.
That's really exciting, and I appreciate the kind of you having this area to share out that there's reason for hope. I'm also curious whether the Oregon Ag Heritage Program is an option to for growers who are doing the right thing to keep doing the right thing. And this belies my only knowing enough to be extremely dangerous position. So if this isn't the right forum, or I'm blending my metaphors, please just tell me that and I'll shut up. Thanks.
I can speak to that real quickly. That those Healthy Soils grants in the Healthy Soils bill that I just mentioned are part of the Oregon Ag Heritage Program's Conservation Management Plan sub-grant section.
Thanks,
Happy
Megan.
to fill you in more on that.
Great. I see Rick and then Jen.
Yeah, just real quick. I'm part of the Stafford Hamlet. We're surrounded by 4 of the top 5 greenhouse gas emitters in the region out here. 205 is going to come through. We got diversion coming through our area. There's a group of us that are trying to work with the cities in Clackamas County and trying to get a carbon sequestration regional zone going. Anybody that could help information-wise of how to start that ball rolling?
We can follow up with you after. I think that's a little outside of the topic, but yeah, I'm happy to talk with you, Rick.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
Yep. Jen.
Oh, I don't have a good answer to how to, you know, reward the farmers who are already doing a good job, but I think we could start by you know, better communication of the really great work that they are doing. I think that would go a really long way to help promote them and to then build off of their successes. I know a lot of the farmers that we work with are amazing and really, you know, cutting edge type of people. You know, not everybody's doing it, and sure, they would like to, you know, have some monetary reward for all of their previous hard work. But I think, you know, just step one, if we could, you know, change the communication emphasis, that I think would mean a lot to them, and it would help propel things forward. So that's kind of step one, where we're just trying to say, how much is even it here? And then, you know, relate that to some other metrics. So that's kind of one of our things we're emphasizing. Thank you.
I'll just add on that soil health, I think, and most people in that arena view soil carbon sequestration as just a great hopeful benefit, and it really shouldn't be the focus. So ideally, legislators will understand that funding needs to go to the great benefits of soil health for the soil health reasons, not necessarily to allow other companies to reduce their emissions. If it happens to work out that way, great. But I do know of one program that's they're working their way up to the national level. It's called the STAR program, that actually does reward farmers for their current practices. And essentially, if they're a gold star, which is it's a 1 to 5 scale, but if they hit a 5-star on it, which is very hard to do, you'll get that highest tier payment, and you'll keep getting that payment if you maintain it at those levels. So meaning you implemented essentially a 1-star would be kind of baseline. That's what the industry average is of like 80% of farmers. And as you add in more soil health practices, you get more stars and paid for your star level essentially. So there are pathways that are potentially opening up. I know Washington is actually about to roll that out, or at least start working on that program to roll it out in their state. Colorado got a big grant from that USDA Climate Smarts grant to do that at a national level. And then it started in Illinois at a soil and water conservation district, but it's a potential pathway.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. This was really informative. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. And let's give a round of applause to Mike and Jen, and then we'll
Thank you so much.
yeah, and we'll give you an update. We'll share the notes and the reporting. I'll ask Mike and Jen for their slides if they're willing, and then we'll share them out, and we'll go from there. We'll see you at the next Tricky Topics conversation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for being here. Bye-bye.